today I'd like to tell you a little bit about a favorite saint of mine, St. Augustine of Canterbury. I think whenever we look at the saints, what we want to do is not just take some sort of pleasure in hearing the story about a good and faithful Christian, but we want to take the lessons of that good and faithful Christian's life and apply them to our own. And so I've always liked St. Augustine of Canterbury because, as good as he was, he had at least one moment of great imperfection, and it's something for us all to think about. Well, St. Augustine was born somewhere in the 600s AD. We don't know exactly when he was born, but he was a monk who lived in Rome. He was the prior at his abbey, which meant he was sort of the second in command. Now, the abbot in his abbey was his good friend Gregory, who became Pope Gregory. Now we call him Pope St. Gregory the Great, one of the greatest popes of all time. Well, Gregory decided he should send his friend, Augustine, on a mission, and that mission was to England. Now, when we think about England today, we think about this nice modern land that is part of Europe. But in those days, England was a very different place. It had been conquered by the Roman Empire hundreds of years before, but in the days of the barbarian invasions, the Romans finally pulled out and left the people who were living in what is now England to their own devices to face the barbarians themselves. And so the Angles and the Saxons came sweeping in and just devastated the country. And so England was really divided up into two parts. There was the part that were controlled by the Angles and the Saxons, and then there was the part where the people lived whose ancestors were there in the old days, people who were of Celtic ancestry, people who had some Lenten ancestry, and they lived in the western portions, what's now Wales and Cornwall and all that. Well, anyway, there was great friction, great hatred between those two groups. And Augustine was sent by his friend Gregory to Christianize the Angles and the Saxons. Well, he was sent not alone, but he was sent to be a missionary with a bunch of other priests and some other missionaries. And they made their way across what is now modern-day France and got to the English Channel. Well, there, they saw a body of water that was storm-tossed. It seemed terrible. And when they talked to the local inhabitants about the Anglo-Saxons, they heard these terrible stories about these incredibly barbaric people who could be cruel, who could be incredibly violent, who could be, well, just awful. And so Augustine decided this was not the ministry for him. So he left his followers there. He went back to Rome and said to his friend Gregory, the Pope, sorry, this just isn't a good time, this isn't the right ministry for me, or this is impossible. Well, anyway, he reported failure without ever having set foot in England. Well, Gregory was having none of that. And so he said to Augustine, Augustine, I gave you a mission, I told you where we need you, and go on back. And so Augustine went, and in 597, they landed in England. And he met a king named Ethelbert, whose wife was a Christian, and he had given her permission to worship her own faith. And so when Augustine came, there were some Christians there, but he was met with some enthusiasm, actually, because of the king's wife, the queen. And within a year, he baptized the king, Ethelbert. He started setting up monasteries throughout the land, and by the time he died, the Angles and the Saxons were much more Christian than they were before. Many, many were Christians. But it all began because somebody, in this case Augustine, showed up. Now, why do I like Augustine of Canterbury? Well, when I think back to the good old days when I was a young child, I think back to my kindergarten year. And when my dad died, we found in a box all these pieces of paper about his children, all sorts of old report cards, class pictures, all the things he had saved over the years. And one of those things was my report card from kindergarten. There I was, Richard Allen, at Hickory Township schools, and my teacher's name was Miss Myers. And it turns out I was not a sterling kindergarten student. I followed directions. I got a 2. That's like a C. I take part in rhythmic and musical activities. 2. That's like a C. I can manage my body well. A 3. That's like an F. Well, anyway, and then at the end of my report card, she wrote, Dick has a tendency to give up easily and needs to develop self-confidence in his work. Obviously a kid hater. But the thing was, she was probably right in that last part. I did have a tendency to give up easily. And I think that's what attracts me to St. Augustine of Canterbury. You know, I had 4 older brothers, and I'm sure I was used to losing. I'm sure I was used to being second best or 5th best. And so I probably gave up rather more easily than I should. And she saw that when I was 5 years old. The thing about Augustine of Canterbury is the dangers he was imagining, well, they were real. The English Channel was a tough body of water to travel over, and the Angles and the Saxons were rather violent. So he was scared, and scared for good reason. But once the Pope actually gave him that shove and said, complete the mission, carry it out, do your best, and see what happens, well, he went and he found great success. God found great success, because Augustine finally said, you know what, I'll give it a try. Now what you need to do is look at your own life. Think of all those times in which you quit, or think of all those moments in which maybe you were intimidated, and think about them again from all these years later and ask yourself, how much good could have been done? How much success could I have had if I just would have given it a try? Now, I've been unsuccessful in so many things over the course of my life. These things happen, but every success I can point to began with a moment in which I said, you know what, I think I can do that. And in giving it the attempt and making the attempt, well, I allowed great things to happen. And that's how we need to be. If you think about it in spiritual terms, what Augustine found was, even though he was imperfect, God worked through him, and a great many good things took place. The same thing can be true in our own lives. If we just give God a chance to work his miracles in us, on us, and through us, who knows what good can be accomplished. You might look at the problems of the world, or maybe even the problems of your own life, and think they're insurmountable. Well, they aren't. Some problems will always be with us, but we can at least make things better. We can make a dent, we can build the kingdom, we can help God's plan to unfold. But it starts with us saying, yes, God, I'll give it a try. So I hope you think about this. Next time you might give up or not try at all, and say, St. Augustine of Canterbury, pray for me. Thank you for listening.